Today we're going to talk about Distill, Bauhaus, and Surrealism. In the Distill, we're going to focus on Mondrian. In the Bauhaus, we're going to focus on the Bauhaus's founder, as well as Jeff Albers, Annie Albers, Paul Klee, and some different people, Marie Barnett as well. And in Surrealism, we're going to talk about Dali and Sigmund Freud. After you get done with this unit, you'll need to take a unit quiz and then take or do 2 of the Delve Deeper activities. If you have questions about that, please feel free to pick up the phone and call me. I'm more than happy to walk you through anything that you have questions on. Okay, so who was Mondrian and why is Distill important? Mondrian was part of a utopian movement in the Netherlands. It was called Distill, and it was named after a magazine that was titled Distill. When you translate that from Dutch, it means the style. He follows this main idea that beauty takes on 2 forms, a sensual and subjective form, and a higher rational universal beauty form. He was Dutch, but was influenced by Cubism. He took a trip to Paris in 1912, and there he met Picasso and Barak. And I don't know if you remember me talking to you about the Café Gats and sort of the air or the sort of climate that the Café Gats brought about. But it brought about a collaborative climate in which people were able to sit and just hash out philosophical ideas about the world. It was sort of like being in a college lunchroom with professional artists and professional practicing philosophers. Not just artists gathered at the Café Gats. Visual fine artists gathered there, but so did writers and philosophers and scientists and anybody who wanted to sit around and talk about the world in which they lived. And the epicenter of that was in Paris. So back to my point was that Mondrian went to Paris in 1912 and he would have met Picasso and Barak there. He begins abstracting things to their most basic forms after he goes on his trip to Paris. He wanted to reach the universal through pure plastic art, which meant that he wanted to reduce colors to as very few as possible. He wanted to reduce art to basic lines and basic shapes. And so you end up with this style called the Distill. Distill was a school of art that originated in the Netherlands in 1917. It was characterized by rectangular shapes and primary colors. Now, when I say a school of art, that really means an artistic theory, not a physical school. The Distill literally meant the style. We said that. And it was founded by painter and architect Theo van Doesburg in Leiden. Leiden is a city in the Netherlands, and it was founded in 1917. It encompassed a new type of style in modern art and architecture. The movement used artistic talent of the artists by designing homes, buildings, and furniture. We're going to get ready to look at Rietvald's work and how that fits into the Distill. But before we look at Rietvald, let's talk a little bit about this composition by Mondrian. So way back in the day, whenever I went to CCAD, I took this class, and it was called Two-Dimensional Design, and it was taught by Professor Friends. And she taught us to The first project was to take a white piece of paper and a black piece of paper and cut the black piece of paper into rectangles. The rectangles didn't have any specifications on them. You could make any size, shape, whatever rectangle you wanted. But you were only allowed to use black and white. And they wanted you to move the rectangles around the piece of paper until you got an interesting and pleasing composition. And so I took my papers and I moved the rectangles around and glued them down, and then we came back to class to see what genius ideas came out from everybody else. So for Mondrian, he really has sort of been the poster child of excellent two-dimensional design. And if he had been in my class, Professor Friends would have hung his work up on the board and said, very well done. Obviously, he didn't stick to the black and white rule. He uses color in the compositions. Color makes things a little bit more complicated, and I know that doesn't seem logical based on what you see in front of you. But color has a natural inherent value to it. So if you map value out on a scale, 1 being the lightest and 10 being the darkest, what you find is that red has a natural value of about a 6. And then blue is right there above red. The color yellow's natural value is about a 2. It's very high on the value scale, meaning that it doesn't have a lot of natural inherent value. So if I took this and made a black and white photocopy of what you see in front of you, the red would be darker, the yellow would be lighter. Mondrian knows that the color also deals with another concept of chroma, how bright the color is. And so red is a very chromatic color. It's very bright and it's very light. Yellow is a very chromatic color. It is very bright and it's very light. It's about a 2 on the value scale, but on the chroma scale, it's a 10. And so Mondrian knows these things about color values and color theories, and he moves the shapes around the canvas to create balance. And what seems to be something that is very static tends to have a lot of movement. Now, in Mondrian's philosophy, this was beauty on a higher level, right? This was beauty of the unconscious mind, the logical reasoning, beauty of logical reasoning. And so he really wanted to pare every single thing that he saw down to its most basic form. Its most basic form was color and then line, which all created rectangles and squares. He leaves white on the canvas, but he does it in a very intentional way. And then he puts the color on the canvas in a very intentional way. So knowing that the yellow is very isolated in the lower right-hand corner, and it's done in such a way that this small rectangle really pops because there's no yellow anywhere else in the composition, but also because it's used so sparingly and it's so very bright, it adds this sort of arrow here to where you're going to look. You're looking straight at that yellow square. And then the red is the next bullseye. And so he needs something to balance out the red, and so he puts the blue on the other side. The red is so powerful that without using the absence of color with the black and white lines and the white rectangles, you'd never move your eyes around from the red square. And so he figures out that there's a scientific reason in which our eyes are attracted to something in terms of the way it moves and in terms of its beauty. And so he uses these thoughts and ideas to create a universal language of beauty. This is True Us Schroeder. True Us was a woman who worked with Rietveld. Her husband died and she needed a new house to raise her 3 children in. And so she hires Rietveld to create a house for her. He had never designed a house before, and so this was a really big deal. It was sort of his dream project, and he made her a house that was very unconventional. He was not a architect who liked to follow the status quo. He very much liked to change things up a bit. He did not like anything that was similar to what was popular in design at the time. Truus knew this. She was a very unconventional person. And so she wanted something avant-garde, and so she went to him to create it. So this is the Schroeder house. Rietveld designed it for Truus, and you can see its beautiful lines of symmetry. You can also see how Mondrian's designs transferred into this three-dimensional concept. Every board is there for a specific reason. It has interlocking planes and linear type details that are then complemented by these little pops of color. And the pops of color help your eye move around the object in a three-dimensional way. And he incorporates the natural colors of the environment by using those large see-through windows that create the walls and the corners. So moving on to a new era of art called the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was founded in 1919 by a man named Walter Gropius. He developed a school with a focus of collaboration of skills combined with formal training in architecture. Gropius opposed the education of women as architects and felt that they should do more gender-appropriate art like textiles and pottery. Gropius employed several professors who were very famous artists like Paul Klee, Jeff Albers. Jeff Albers' wife, Annie Albers, was part of their group. And of course, Wassily Kandinsky. So Kandinsky, Paul Klee, and Albers were all of a like mind in that they felt that the Bauhaus's ideals were an important philosophy in art. The Bauhaus was art. I told you that the Bauhaus really was not a place that encouraged women to participate in certain artistic mediums like architecture. There were women that were included in the Bauhaus, but they were encouraged to stick to crafts. They were encouraged to stick to weaving and tapestry making and things that were deemed more appropriate for women to do. So sculpture, especially sculpture in silver, was something that really bucked the system. Marion Brandt was an artist who did such system bucking. She created the very first work of art that was a functional object. It is this tea set that she created. And she really is the mother of industrial design. She had this idea. The idea was that the form should follow the function of the object. So not a lot of foo-foo, clean lines, lines that were there for a purposeful reason. So if the handle was going to be on the pot, it needed to be ergonomically important in terms of how it fits into the palm of your hand. it had to function in a way that was attesting to the higher mind. It had to function in a way that was just as beautiful as it was beautiful as an object. These ideas led Bauhaus designs to be modern, simple, and elegant. Here's a close-up of her silver teapot. This teapot is made of silver and was a prototype for the teapot that would be mass-produced. The mass-produced teapot would have been created in nickel, so silver obviously was very expensive, something that couldn't be mass-produced that way. Brandt eventually leaves the Bauhaus, but before she did, she designs lighting fixtures and table lamps for mass production. Here we see the beginnings of the Industrial Design Revolution. This is Annie Albers. She married Joseph Albers, who was a professor for the Bauhaus School. She was a painter, but she knew that being in the Bauhaus, she couldn't join the Bauhaus School as a painter because they didn't allow women to do things like paint or sculpt. They felt that those were male activities. And so she decided that she would take her paintings and create tapestries out of them. And so the textiles were very innovative. They replaced paintings in a lot of modern buildings. They sort of harken back to those medieval days in which paintings were used to create patterns for large wall hangings. She liked the natural elements of the textile. She liked the natural elements of texture within the textile. She often wove in silk. And she felt like it was beautiful because all materials occurred in nature in tapestries. They appeared organically. And she uses them in their pure form, meaning that she doesn't add synthetic additives to the fibers. She wants the silk, she wants the wool, she wants the fiber without any chemical alteration. Early, she uses them in a way that sort of mimics her painting designs. And she feels like the weaving is better than painting because painting is something that you do as a chemical alteration, whereas weaving is something that you do in a pure organic form. So in 1933, Hitler squelches art schools like the Bauhaus. He dislikes anything that's avant-garde. He thinks that Germany should only have art that is Western and classical. He used to be a painter, and when he was a painter, as a child, he formed a really big hatred for modern art. He eventually runs the Bauhaus out of Germany, and most of the modern artists flee to New York City. In 1937, he organizes an exhibition to publicly embarrass and harass modern artists as a whole. His goal was to purify German culture. And so he creates this show called The Degenerate Art. And he is trying to seek out that modern art and destroy it. He looks at modern art as sick and degrading. Avant-garde works in the show, he decides that he's going to display avant-garde works, and then he writes slanderous sayings on the wall and negative things about the modern art. As a result, the works of art were sometimes hidden in Munich before artists fled to New York City. The modern artists were scared. They were afraid of having all of their works stolen and destroyed, which we know Hitler took works and destroyed them. But they also were afraid that if they took them with them to the United States, they would be taken from them. And so sometimes they hid them in places like Munich. The odd or ironic, I suppose, thing about the art show, the Degenerate Art, is that it traveled all over Germany, and over 2 million people saw the show because it traveled all over Germany and Hitler was trying to put it down. But I think in the end, it gave positive exposure to the works of art. The people who saw the works did not feel negatively the way Hitler had hoped. Here is an image from Getty Images of people unpacking avant-garde art that had been hidden in Nazi Germany before they fled to the United States. So we're going to move on to Surrealism. Surrealism in general as an artistic movement is art that is representing the unconscious mind. It was inspired by Sigmund Freud and Jung, who, Jung is a guy who developed a personality test. His name was Carl Jung. And you can go online, search up Carl Jung, and he, I think he was the guy that invented disc theory. But you can take a personality test and he'll tell you all about the person that you are. So we see different types of surrealism. One is a more naturalistic surrealist approach. We see these realistic dreamscapes and a sense of concrete irrationale. So surrealism was a movement that was defined by a poet named Andre Benton. He begins the movement and defined the movement in a book that he wrote titled The Surrealist Manifesto. In that book, he talks about where surrealism comes from and the ideas of automatism. He says that pure psychic automatism, by which one intends to express verbally, in writing, or by any other method, the real functioning of the mind, dictation by thought in the absence of any control exercised by reason and beyond any aesthetic or moral preoccupation. So obviously Benton felt that we as people have social boundaries programmed into our mind in which we don't say what we think because the mind sort of censors what we speak. This is Rene Magritte. Magritte really didn't become popular until the 50s. He came from a wealthy family. His mom committed suicide. He studied at the Academy of Beaux-Arts in Brussels, but he eventually dropped out. He was influenced by Cubism and produced a massive amount of work. In 1920, he moves to Paris and was unsuccessful there. Then he moves back to Brussels to start a commercial art business. When times were hard during World War II, he painted forgeries of Picasso's, Van Gogh's, and Cézanne's. He also painted forgeries of banknotes. Eventually, the Surrealists take a more literal presentation of dream images, where free association is determined in the images and symbols that are selected. This becomes a trajectory for artists of the movement to explore the content and mechanisms of the unconscious mind. Here, Magritte paints these three floating orbs in space because the surrealists are often trying to represent something visually that doesn't actually exist in all reality in a form, right? So if you're trying to paint the unconscious mind, nobody's ever seen what the unconscious mind is. It doesn't necessarily have form. And so this interesting imagination or interesting presentation of the form is something that we end up associating subconscious things with. Magritte really is the master of this. I think the one that he does that is most famous is this next one. The image of the pipe that says it's not a pipe. My French is horrible, or I would read that for you, but basically it translates to this is not a pipe. Magritte's basically playing with the idea of this object is not actually the thing itself. He questions the relationship of the image and the object. And he creates a relationship between the text and the image. And this way, the text becomes part of the image. He focuses on a technique called trompe-l'oeil, which means that to fool the eye so much that you actually think the real thing is there instead of a painting. It raises assumptions that viewers tend to make about art, and wreaks havoc on the viewer's reliance on the conscious and the irrational. So we rely on the thing that we see in front of us. Yes, like we know, okay, I know that is a ball. I can reach it. I can reach out and touch it. It's round. Maybe it's a tennis ball, so it's fuzzy. We rely on our brain's experience with that object to have reference of what the object is. In this case, he's questioning that relationship. He's saying, well, this pipe isn't exactly in your hands, but you think it's a pipe. Eventually, surrealists begin taking a more literal presentation of dream images, where that free association is determined in the image and symbols that are selected. This becomes a trajectory for artists of the movement to explore the content and mechanisms of the unconscious mind. Many wonder if this particular painting is about the kiss of denied love. Magritte was unique in that he often painted many versions of the same painting. Freudian theory states that this repetition of the subconscious mind is from trauma. And then, of course, we come to the father of all surrealism, Salvador Dali. Surrealism was a movement that was highly influenced by the writings of Sigmund Freud. Dali often tried to get Picasso to join them, but Picasso refused to. Why? Because surrealist art was focused on the dreamlike state. It was centered in the unconscious, and Picasso was about the critical thing that was in front of him. He only wanted to paint things that he saw, and he only wanted to paint the reality of what he saw. So even though Cubism looks very unrealistic to us, Picasso was trying to create a new viewpoint on something that was in front of him. Oftentimes when we talk about surrealism, we talk about subconscious frustrations. Dali, from the writings of Sigmund Freud, often painted about sexual frustrations and sexual dysfunction. This is an image of Salvador Dali in New York. He's standing on a boat that overlooks the New York harbor. Dali's representation. In Dali's The Presence of Memory, we see that these hard objects becoming inexplicably limp. They all of a sudden, like, we know them to be rigid objects that sort of disintegrate and lay over top of trees and over top of things that look like horses but aren't horses. The objects become part of a dream type scape. He's fascinated with the idea of decomposition and the idea of death. Dali paints with a great amount of precision, even though the ideas that he paints are somewhat unconventional. They're somewhat, it's hard to explain that Dali paints a clock that's melting with an insurmountable amount of precision, because why? I've never seen a clock actually melt before. His idea of decomposing clocks really doesn't have anything to do with death. It has to do with the ability to look at the painting and realize that he's not depicting something that is part of the world around you. He's depicting something that's in the subconscious mind, and so that's a way that he's using the imagery to communicate that he's discussing the subconscious mind. The surrealists really wanted to confuse the viewer, to help take the viewer out of the world of reality and create a disoriented world of the subconscious. I think Dali thought that if he created enough confusion, the viewer would have a reaction to his work that was a subconscious reaction. He does include reality, though. Like, you see the mountain in the background. It looks like a mountain. That's a mountain. He includes tree branches that obviously are coming off of a table. So I guess it's not the most realistic looking tree. This orange oval that's close to the front of the picture plane has ants crawling all over them, which is a common theme in Dali's work. They are a symbol of decay. This is the back of a pocket watch. This is Dali's Geopoliticus child watching the birth of the new man. And I put it in here because it was a interesting comparison to the one that we just looked at. The painting that we just looked at was about death and decomposition, and this one is about birth. Dali had some interesting ideas about birth. You see that this man is breaking free through the eggshell of a well-developed world. In fact, we see Africa and Europe right in front of us, with an emphasis on the Middle East. And then, of course, you see South America. So another one of the important artists in the Surrealist time was Max Ernst. Ernst believed in automatism. He felt that automatism was a way to communicate the a way to communicate and release information from the mind. Ernst studies data before he joins the Surrealists, and he creates a new technique called frottage. It's a technique, I know most of us used to do it as a kid. You'd take a piece of paper and a crayon, and you would put it over something that had texture, like outside. Like sometimes we used to do it when we would go to the cemetery. We would take a crayon and do a rubbing of what was on the front of the tombstone. I know it's a little demented, but sometimes they had pretty pictures. At any rate, that process of doing the crayon rubbing on top of something that has a texture to it is something that Ernst was interested in developing in his art. And so he takes this technique and transfers it into a painting technique. And he begins by using a crayon and doing that crayon rubbing of the texture. And then he takes that rubbing and studies it and pulls an image out of the crayon rubbing, sort of like a Rorschach image. This is Max Ernst the Horde, and it represents his work with frottage. He adapts the frottage technique for painting, and so he calls it grattage. And he creates this image by laying the paint on the canvas, and then taking the canvas and laying it on top of the textured thing, and then scraping off the paint. So wherever the texture hits the canvas and the paint will be left behind. I encourage you to watch a YouTube video about that process so you understand it a little bit better. I think it's hard to describe. The imagery, though, that he creates whenever he does these frottages seems to deal with World War I. Ernst was somewhat traumatized by the war in Germany. He was living in Germany at the time. And so a lot of his works feel somewhat horrific, they have sharp edges and sharp angles. The people and entities within them seem not even human-like, almost monstrous. This is a surrealist sculpture that seems to be a favorite of viewers. It tends to be an upsetting sculpture to viewers. Oppenheim is juxtaposing two things that we don't oftentimes see together. She takes a saucer and a cup and a spoon and covers them with gazelle hair. Excuse me, and then the sculpture takes on this like anthropomorphic quality. The sculpture came out of a conversation at lunch with Picasso. And she was sitting there having lunch with Picasso, and she was wearing a bracelet, and it was covered in fur. And he said something like, "Gee, you'll cover anything with fur." And so she thought, "Yeah, I'll show you. I'm going to go home and cover the cup and saucer with fur." Men in the surrealist community thought that women were only to be viewed as objects of desires or muses. Picasso definitely played into that concept, even though he wasn't a surrealist. He would marry someone, use them as a muse, get them pregnant, and then move on to a different woman. They definitely didn't feel that men and women were equals. Oppenheim kind of is playing a clever game here. She's kind of giving Picasso the visual bird in that she decided she would cover the saucer and the cup with fur. You put your mouth to the cup, and so she's basically uh, talking about the resemblance of the texture of pubic hair. Um, it's, at any rate, a definitely interesting sculpture. I've seen it in person. I believe it's at the Met or the MoMA, maybe the MoMA. It's just a regular sized saucer and a regular sized cup. It is quite fascinating how the fur covers it so gracefully and elegantly. You don't really see a whole lot of lines in the work, just a sense of beautiful texture on an odd surface. So, biomorphic surrealism is sort of an offshoot of surrealism that was developed by a man named Joan Miro. Miro is from Latin America, I believe, and he develops a painting style that has no distinctive narrative whatsoever. And because of that, we get these organic looking abstracted forms. It basically automatism to reach the unconscious. It's a technique where the artist abandons the usual role of intellectual control over the brushes or pencils and allows the subconscious to create artwork without rational interference. It's spontaneous and it seems to have a sense of intuitive expression. He does play with the positive, negative shapes. You can see them, especially on this bean-like shape at the front, where the image seems to have been cut and then flipped over to the right. Here's another one of those biomorphic compositions that Joan Miro does. If you ever get to see one of them up close, it's really interesting how the flat object that's solid tends to create a sense of depth within the composition, even though the composition is very flat. So the white images that are solid seem to come forward to the viewer, whereas the ones that are less weighty, that are just lines, tend to look like the background. Henry Moore is another one of those surrealist artists that was a sculptor. I wanted to show you his work because he has a piece at the Columbus Museum of Art. It sits right outside in the front foyer of the steps at the original entrance that faces Broad Street. You see a reclining female nude. It was inspired by Shamul, which was a reclining human figure in Toltec and Mayan art. Moore was known for working with special qualities of textures and materials, and so he sort of takes the quality of the texture and the material and lets it dictate how he wants to represent the form. This one's created of stone, and you can see how he has the figure laying parallel to the grain of the stone. I've seen him do woodwork where the figure will lay parallel to the grain of the woodwork.